we'll take up the meat, so it will come to our temperature. Everything else.
So hi everyone, welcome to the 30th investigatability seminar, full exhibition. And our first speaker today is Peter Gerdes. We're talking about a not trivial 3 REA set not computing a week 3 generic.
Thank you for inviting me. I know as some of you from Wisconsin have seen this talk before, but at the end, maybe you want to wake up. I've added some new things about motivations and some questions, because I like to try and add a couple of questions or things of interest at the in my talks. All right, so let's start with
Dennis.
Use the key then if you.
What's going on?
the little clicker is no longer working. I guess I'll just.
Oh, okay. I'll come and take a look. Just start and I'll come.
Oh, there we go. Okay, we got it now. All right, there you go. So I'll start with just some notations and definitions, and I'll give some background at the end. I'll give a sort of brief overview of the difficulties in the new results and some remarks about how to solve it, and finally some related questions and conjectures. So first, some standard notation. We have sigma tau, new range over partial binary valued functions, and we talk about extension. We identify sets with their characteristic function. The only sort of perhaps unfamiliar notation is we're going to say that f is delta 0 n plus 1 escaping if f isn't dominated by any function computable in 0 to the n. The rest of the notation should be standard. Right. And just to remind you about what a NREA or alpha REA set is, the ith hop is just the operation that adds the set you take the hop of to the ith set RE in that set. So it's,
Peter, if I could just stop for a second. If it's possible for you to stand between the two boards, people are complaining they can't see you.
all right,
Yeah,
is
there
this
you go.
work?
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right, great. All right, and so then REA sets, recursively numeral above, sets of the results of iterating the hop operation, starting with the empty set. And so then if you work through this definition, the one REA sets of the RE sets, two REA sets of the sets of the form an RE set, plus a set that's RE in the first set. And you can see Jackson Shore for a more explicit definition.
They're both on the Zoom. They could take it.
All right. Well, great. Thanks, Peter. All right. All right. And for this talk, we only care about NREA sets up to Turing degree. And so I find it useful to identify the components of an NREA set with their column. So in this case, if you look at a set here, the first column would be the RE part, the second column would be the part that's RE in the first part, and so on. All right. In this talk, we're just going to talk about we're mostly going to talk about the standard force simulation on to the less than mega, standard definition of generic, your n generic would be forced, all sigma 0 n sentences are their negations. And just to remind you about weakly generic, find a subset of 2 to the less than omega to be dense if there's an element that's if for any string, there's some element of the set that extends extra. And then G is weakly n generic if G meets every dense sigma 0 n subset. And remember that the n plus 1 weakly generic set is n generic, but it does not need to be n plus 1 generic. All right. So let's talk about some results from that sort of lead up to this that I did with Uri and Joe. So first, if we have a function f that's delta 0 1 escaping, then f computes a weak 1 generic. So remember, delta 0 1 escaping, that just means it's not dominated by any computable function. So without loss of generality, we can assume that it's monotonically decreasing. Or I should say this result is actually substantially older. I was not able to actually trace down the original source of this, but since they both are. So if f is monotonically increasing and use of I is the RE subset of strings, then we're going to just build G as a limit of a bunch of strings, that are extending each other, And what we're going to do is we're sort of going to say, F is going to tell us sort of how long we look for an extension of, say, tau sub n that gets us into the ith RE set. And the idea is that, okay, if we can find it in, at the n plus first stage, we look f of n plus 1 many steps to see if we can find something that gets, to find a extension that gets us into one of the first n RE sets. All right, and now suppose that we have one of these use is actually dense, but G doesn't meet it. Well, so let's just consider, let's let n be large enough that we're, that for everything less than, we have some first counterexample, that for every j less than I, either the set we construct actually does get it, it's actually witnessed to meet it, or we're never going to meet that thing. All right, and now suppose, and I'll discharge this in a second, that we actually can compute a bound L sub m on the length of T sub m, tau sub m. So, so we know a bound in the length of each the extension we take at each stage. All right, so now we can define a computable function h of m that just is the least stage, such that such that we can find the extension that is in u sub I of the string tau sub m. So basically, there's a computable function. If we since we actually know that G doesn't meet this u sub I, but there's infinitely many chances to do so, there's a computable function that tells us, well, how many stages would we have had to look to see that we could have met that? All right. Well, consider that function f. Then that function f is now going to give that function f is that function h is now going to bound a function is now going to be a bound in a function f, and that's going to be a contradiction because h is going to be computable and f was by supposition not dominated by any computable function. And just note that we're going to be able to discharge this assumption that each house of there we have a bound on this we can discharge this assumption that we have a bound in the length of the tau sub m's because we can say that if we know that none of those tau sub m's can be so long that they would have seen the witness to get into the set. So just remark that that means that at least if u sub I is dense, then this G eventually has to be. All right. So what happens if we go to RE set rather than just talking about any old function that is not dominated by any computable function? Well, notice that if we have an RE set, that the modulus of that set, so the function that tells us how many stages we have to compute for it to be correct on the first n bits of A, that function isn't dominated by any computable function. If it was, the set would actually be a computable RE set. So, so now this actually gives us a little bit more power. The fact that we have this computable approximation to A actually that means that we don't just compute a weak one generic, we can compute a full one generic. So how do we do this? Well, it's basically the same idea as the construction below, but we're going to use a stage-wise approximation and allow restraint. Right? And the problem was that in the last case, what we had to do is we had to say, we had to figure out find a stage such that we could extend any possibility, any possible, no matter what our construction looked like up to stage n. We don't know what it is, but we had to find a computable function that says, we can extend any string of that length and get into this set. So the set we're trying to get into had to be dense because we didn't have any approximation of what we were building. But now, since we're working with an RE set, we can approximate this. We can approximate the set we're building G, and that lets us define a computable function that tells us how long it takes the particular thing that's being built to sort of how many stages it takes to see that can be extended to meet some particular RE set of strings. I'm going to these are going to be on the this is going to be on the slide on the web, so you can look at the details second. But basically,
Is there a quiz later? Because otherwise I'm going to forget.
No, I'm just about to tell you can ignore this. Okay, that was the point. All right. So this exactly you can ignore this. Basically, what it's saying is that we try and we do the same thing we did before, except now that if we see at some point that it looks like we can meet some set, we impose restraint and say, preserve that that thing that said we got into that set and keep that. All right. And basically, it's the same argument, and it's the principle I just told you before. Now we have an approximation of what we're doing, so we can come up with a computable function that tells us how many stages we need to look for to get into that set. Right. And this is basically this is just the same argument we just gave before, except now we use the approximation. All right. So great. So any RE set computes a full one generic. What happens if we go to two generis? So this is the earlier work I was talking about. So this says that if we have a function that's delta 02 escaping, so f isn't computed by any function computable in 0 don't, then f has to compute a weak 2 generic. So I'm not going to prove this here. You can see it in the paper, but the basic idea is that we can't any longer be sure that we have that when we extend to meet this sigma 02 set, we can't be sure we've met it. But what we can do is we can say, oh, we can try and meet it and look for sort of the way to meet it that involves the least witness for X. And it turns out that if you do that, then yeah, you might have some moralities that you think you met it, but you didn't. But if infinitely often there is a way that you could meet it, you will eventually do that. So, all right. So that has to be true. This hypothesis, I've actually verified this since, but yeah, it turns out that as you might expect, if instead of just working with a delta 02 escaping function, we talk about a 2 REA function that isn't computable from 0 jump, then that's going to compute a full 2 generic, not just a weakly 2 generic. And it's the same idea. Now you have an approximation of what you're doing, so you can rather than getting a function that measures how long it takes to get into a dense sigma 02 set, you can get a function that measures how long it takes to get into a sigma 02 set that extends the particular thing you're building. All right. So now what happens if you take this up to 3 generates? All right. So unfortunately, and I'll explain why that's unfortunate at the end of the talk, but unfortunately, the pattern doesn't hold. So it turns out there's a true perfect omega branching tree T, so that is computable 0 double jump, such that every path through it doesn't compute a weak 3 generic. Here by omega branching, I mean that any point where the tree branches at all, it has omega many branches. Right. And so just some terminology I'm going to use. It's called a vertex is just a node with multiple successors. By the branching, every vertex has infinitely many immediate successors. Pruned is no terminal nodes. It's perfect. Every node is extended by a vertex. So what's the sort of idea behind this? I'll tell you what the idea behind this in a second. But let me first tell you, there's some consequences of this here. Notice that this is essentially telling us that no countable amount of non-domination suffices to compute a weak 3 generic. So given any sort of countable collection of functions, we can find some path in this tree which isn't dominated by any of them. And you can do this. We can just think of this tree as a function on omega to the omega. And then we're going to say, okay, we're going to build out some path through this tree by just saying, all right, we'll go up so far, and then we'll pick at the first vertex something that is big enough to make sure we're not dominated by the first function. The second vertex will pick something big enough to make sure we're not dominated by the second function, and so on. And so we can make sure that for that countable list, our path through the tree isn't dominated by anything in it, and that ultimately gives us the result we want. And note that now that the tree is computable in 0 jump. So if f is monotonic and delta 0 n plus 3 escaping, then we can build this path that's computable. We can build the path through T is computable in the sort of the function whose image we're taking plus 0 double jump, and so that this gives us a sort of this gives us a counterexample to claim that this pattern continues at 3. So it is not in fact, so it's not in fact the case that everything that's not, that's not dominated by a function computable in 0 double jump computes a weak 3 generic. All right, so just sort of intuitively, what's going on here? All right, so the pattern worked at the earlier stages because sort of more non-domination strength gave us more sort of computational power. We could guess at membership in sigma 0 sets, and eventually we sort of had to be right. And then we have this function that sort of escaped an even larger function, and then let's guess at sort of membership in sigma 02 sets. but sort of a computable reduction can't always hope to be able to distinguish, you know, if you're 0 to the n big or 0 to the n plus k big, right? And so the basic idea here is that we're going to sort of kind of fail because sort of given, you know, given infinitely many potential, given finally many potential strings that a given computation of phi to the e sigma extended by something can be compatible with. We can sort of at some point we're going to be able to figure out which one of those sort of possibilities is sort of is compatible with infinitely many n. The idea is at some point we're going to be able to look and say, hey, look, you know, we can preserve infinitely many options and you know and still restrict the computation to give us a particular value. Hopefully this will be a little bit more clear in a second. And the idea is that this is going to allow us to limit the computation vis-a-vis of the path we eventually build to a narrow range of options. And if we can sort of make sure that vis-a-vis of f is this narrow range of options, and if we can do that in sort of a zero double jump repeatable way, well, then we're going to be able to build U sub e that's in RE and zero double jump, and it's just going to sort of enumerate the places that we're sure that vis-a-vis of f isn't going to be. So we're sort of going to restrict the places that we're going to try and restrict the number of possible options vis-a-vis of f can take, and then we're going to enumerate the places that aren't possibly one of those that vis-a-vis of f can't possibly be. And to sort of go at this is the limit here. Basically, you know, if you sort of ignore all the particular details, it basically says that if zero double jump can figure out, you know, can say that, oh, vis-a-vis of f has to be, you know, has to be one of these small number of options, and then you know for some, you know, and for some sufficiently, you know, for some sufficient length, if vis-a-vis of f is restricted to be a sufficiently small fraction of the number of strings of that length, then we're going to be able, then it's going to be the case that vis-a-vis of f is not going to be weakly generic. The basic idea is you just count up the number of strings of that particular length, and you know that, you know, okay, well, you're restricted. If we're restricted to being one of these n sub I, well, there has to be something else left over that we're not equal to. And if zero double jump can sort of do this, zero double jump can say, oh, I know here's the guy vis-a-vis of f can't be equal to. All right, so we're just going to keep doing this. That eventually lets us build a dense subset that's RE and zero double jump that vis-a-vis of f can't meet. So how are we going to build this tree? Well, we're going to start out with, you know, we're going to sort of build it by sort of picking locations and we're going to commit to those being vertexes on the tree. And in addition, for each vertex on the tree, we're going to say, we're going to pick an infinite RE set of strings. There are the possible ways that vertex can be extended. So any extension has to extend one of those ways. And so the set of vertexes is going to be v sub x. At any point, it's going to be finite, and eventually the vertexes in the total tree will be just the union of those. At each stage, sigma sub s of any vertex gives the set of possible extensions that vertex can have. And then we're also going to say that, and we're going to want to make sure that there's this, so there's some value that's associated with each vertex for each computation we're considering so far. And this is going to say that, oh, everything that extends that vertex has to say, you know, every f that extends that vertex has to have vis-a-vis of f agree with the value of vis-a-vis of s of that vertex. So that's sort of telling you what the computation of f has, the computation of f extending some element of that vertex has to look like. And I'm going to show you a picture of this in a little second, so hopefully be a little bit more clear, but just remember that v sub s are the nodes and sigma sub s are the possible extensions of something at that network. And then we're having some specification that's sort of limiting what what the computations of those things can look like. Right. And this is good. You can look at this online, but I'm going to skip to the picture because I think that's a little bit more understandable. All right. So what's going on here? So let's say we start building our tree. At the very beginning, we've committed to only one thing being the vertex. That's the root node. All right. And at the start, we have all these, we can have any possible extension of that root node. So, and we just have some vis-a-vis of zeros, say the empty string. So all these guys, and we're only concerned about the zeroth computation here. So all these guys agree on phi sub 0 of whatever they are out to some length 0 actually. So what happens now? Now we're going to want to now at some point we want to say, oh, we want to, we're going to want to add at least one new vertex, right? We're always going to pick the, we're always going to pick the least element for any vertex we already have. We're going to pick the least extension of it and say that guy's going to be a new vertex. All right. And what we're now going to do is we're going to say, okay, all the possible extensions of each vertex, we're going to prune those guys down. And we're going to make sure that they all agree that the computations of, in this case, for the second stage, the computations of phi sub 0 and phi sub 1 of all these guys here have to agree out to some, some long length. And how do we do that? Well, we can ask zero double jump to find us some, some computations that we have infinitely many of these guys that agree on. Or at least it can be extended to agree on. And the other option is, of course, it doesn't converge, but zero double jump can fix that too. So all these guys in red here are going to agree on what their computation is, out to some length, what their computation is for the first two computations. All right, so what happens if we keep doing this? Well, each time we add a vertex, the number of possibilities for computations of, say it's like a phi 0. Well, any computation of phi 0, it has to be either a guy that's extending one of these vertexes, or a guy that's extending one of these vertexes. So right now, there are only two possibilities. After you build 3 vertexes, you get 3 possibilities. And the point is that I can make all these computations that agree on some really long initial segment. And even though I only get to when I have a very small number of options for them, if there are only three different values here, and that is basically saying, look, I can make sure that phi sub e of f has to be one of a very small number of values that's very long, and that's exactly saying that okay, there has to be some places it doesn't meet. Zero double jump can figure out what those are. And therefore, zero double jump can find something that none of these paths can compute. And if we continue with the next stage, of course, we have 2 vertexes there, we have 4, and now everything has to be one of these 4 computations, and so on. All right. So just a remark, I already said so, but look, everything we kind of do there is going to be happening at zero double jump, because zero double jump is the first place we can start asking are there infinitely many solutions to something, and that's why it breaks down at zero double jump, because zero double jump can preserve the fact that the tree is omega prime. All right. So that's sort of what's going on. That's why it fails when we talk about functions that aren't dominated by any function computable in zero double jump. But what happens if we move from that to the case of 3 REA? We saw in the first 2 cases that being, say, either an RE set that gave you more strength than just being not computable, being a 2 REA set gave you more strength than just being not dominated by something in zero jump. So, question: if A is 3 REA and not computable from zero double jump, does A compute a weakly 3 generic? And remember, just saying, A does compute a delta 03 staking function, but as we just saw, that can't possibly be enough because not all those functions compute something that compute a weakly 3 generic. But there's several reasons to think that hey, maybe this, maybe something is different here. That these 3 REA sets have extra power. For one, we don't just get this function that's escaping delta 03, we get simultaneously a function that's escaping delta 03, when it's escaping delta 02, when it's escaping delta 01. And you can even see that all those functions sort of have to simultaneously escape if you line things up right. And also our ability to effectively approximate this set A offers additional power in the same way that it let us go from weakly generic to actually generic in the 1 and 2 cases. So maybe that gives us extra power. And most importantly, the approach we used to build the tree T before just doesn't directly translate. When we built T, remember those functions, phi sub e of f, had to, sort of had to meet this, it had to meet a dense set using only one large value. So we can basically take with T, when we built T, it basically said, oh, here, F is going to be really, really big here. And then it'll be small for like an arbitrary long part of length of time. In fact, it'll, that's what it had to be. And in fact, it can be small for so long, the first large value isn't even big enough to see the second place is large. But that can't happen here. If A is 3 REA, there are going to be infinitely many tuples where where our modulus is large relative to some zero double jump computable function, and it's so large that the value at say the 0th point is large enough to see the kth place where it's large. Now you can't necessarily know that's the kth place, but at least you have that somewhere below M3 of X0 you have at least k values where M3 is large. So infinitely often, in some sense, phi sub of A can consult k large values before trying to meet this sigma 03 dense set. Okay, so, all right, those are the difficulties. Well, does that actually make a difference? No, it doesn't. Unfortunately, I'll explain why it's unfortunate at the end. Unfortunately, there's a 3 REA set A that's computable, that's not computable in zero double jump, that doesn't compute weak through generic. And by the way, we do know that A computes a weak 2 generic just by the result before, and there's a result in the paper mentioned before that every delta 03 escaping function computes a 2 generic. And we have a delta 03 escaping function here. So this is a sort of a good result that you can hope to get. All right. So how do we go about this? What's the time?
28. You have 20 minutes.
All right. Okay. All right. So how do we go about this? I'm not going to go into all the details here, but I want to at least give you a sense of what the difficulty is and sort of the main idea. All right, so what kind of requirements are we going to have? Well, first we have the requirement that says we're not going to be computable in zero double jump. We're just going to directly we're going to not be equal to a double limit. All right, great. And so we also have this requirement Q sub E of theta, which basically says that x sub E here, which we're defining as just the E functional applied to A. If that's actually total, then for that's for sigma, there's some tau extending it, such that tau is in this the E sigma 03 set, and tau is not tau is not initial segment of x sub E. And most importantly, the requirement Q sub E theta is the only way elements get into U sub E, and the reason that matters is that so if that's the only way, that makes sure that everything in U sub E is not an initial segment of x sub E. So building something that extends every element in 2 to the less than omega and doesn't meet x sub E. All right. So if we do that, we will actually build the thing we want. And notice though, we want to break these requirements up into either 2 sub-requirements, because the goal is that we have to make sure that this use of E, I'm now calling it use of alpha because we're going to put this on a tree. That has to be computable. That has to be RE and zero double jump. And if we just and meeting these requirements, well, we can't meet these requirements directly in a way that zero double jump can see how they're satisfied. So what we're going to do is we're going to break them up into pi02 sub-requirements. And that way, zero double jump is going to be able to guess how those we're going to be able to tell how those sub-requirements are satisfied, and thus be able to build use of alpha and RE and zero double jump factor. All right. So let's talk. What's a naive strategy to go about this? All right. So we can break up, the piece of alpha into sub-requirements that that's basically saying that okay, we're going to put this element B sub K into the second column of A. That's the part that's RE that's the part that's 2 REA. And it's going to do that just if we if there are infinitely many, it's going to do that just if we see that there are at least K places where the limit of this computable function is equal to 1. Right? And the idea is that we're going to put, and then we can place C sub alpha into the third column if and only if there's some k that doesn't enter the second column. So if the double limit is going to be equal to, if the double limit is going to be equal to 1, then there have to be infinitely many places that's equal to 1. So all the b sub k should go in, and therefore C sub alpha won't go into A3. On the other hand, if the limit is, if the limit is eventually 0, only finally many get in, and C sub alpha will go in. All right. So that's a strategy. That's a strategy that makes sure that A really is not going to be computable in zero double jump. And while we can't tell if C sub alpha eventually goes into the third column, if zero double jump can tell if each of these, whether each of these b sub k is going to go into the second. All right. So that's the sort of easy requirement. So how do we sort of try to make sure that, how do we try and build this to make sure it doesn't compute a weak free generic? Well, let's try the same approach as T, that sure sort of particular all options, so all the options that A can take agree on a lot of B sub E of A. But as I said, zero double jump can't determine if exactly how the sort of diagonalization requirement is met. But what we can do is sort of say, okay, we're going to try and like accommodate all the ways that all the ways that can be met, or both options where it enters A and where it doesn't enter A, sort of by agreeing on sufficiently long initial settings. But the harder problem is that, remember, with T, we sort of want to make sure that the values C sub E of A can take were sort of restricted with a narrow number of options. So how do we do that? Given that there are sort of infinitely many different ways that we can end up putting this C into A. It could be the case that we put it in because B0 doesn't enter, or we could put it in because B1 doesn't enter. So this is kind of the analog in this construction of trying to maintain the fact that in our tree we need to allow f of x to take on infinitely many different values. And here we're saying that that this is in some sense saying that we need to be able to leave open the option that the modulus is arbitrarily large. So effectively we need to accommodate these infinitely many different options. All right, so here's going to be a picture. So here's sort of here's the sort of naive approach, okay? And the idea is, okay, we're going to try and satisfy this requirement, this diagonalization requirement, P sub alpha. And we're also going to try and make sure that that P sub E of A, all P sub E, all the options for P sub E of A all do extend some particular string, in this case length 2. What we're going to try and do is we're going to try and do that. We're going to try and make that string 0, 0 as hard as we can. If that fails, we'll try and make it 0, 1. If that fails, we'll try and make it 1, 0, and finally 1, 1. And notice that zero double jump would find some other, if in fact that, if in fact C sub alpha doesn't enter, we're not going to worry about that right now. All right. And just remember, this is kind of like a delta 2 construction, because the elements that we're putting into A2 can be removed by an appropriate enumeration into A1. All right. So let's give this a start. So let's say, go ahead at the very beginning, it looks like in our approximation, it looks like P sub E of A extends 1, 1. Great. Now, at some point we get told, oh, we have to put an element in here to meet, to meet the diagonalization requirement. All right, great, we put that in, and now it looks like, our computation P sub E of A extends 0, 0. Well, that's the sort of highest, highest part of the string. So we want to, in some sense, preserve that. All right. But it might be the case that at some later point we're told that we have to, enumerate B1. That's fine. What we're going to, do is we're going to sort of say that, all right, if we enumerate B1, we're going to allow that, but we're going to sort of like we're going to reserve the right to jump back and cancel B1. So what happens if we try and put in B1? Okay, so maybe it's the case that P sub E of A now extends some lower part of string 1, 0. All right, and if B1 stays in, if this is what it looks like forever, fine, we accept it. But maybe at some later point, we get a B2, and that says, oh, now the computation is different. All right. Well, if at some point we see a higher priority string, we're going to say we're going to move up where B2 is. So here, so here we saw higher priority string. We're going to say, okay, now we're going to be able, now we're only, if we want to cancel these guys, you got to cancel sort of all of them down to here. We're picking the side, we're saying that, okay, you can, we might end up deciding we need to take B1. But if we take B1, we have to take everything else up out of here. We're going to say the same thing about B2. All right. And so what's the, what's the eventual upshot of this? Well, let's say that infinitely often we see our computation phi sub of A extends 0, 0, the highest priority requirement. Well, that means we'll have infinite many values for B where the computation looks like it extends 0, 0. And that means if we drop back to that point in time, then that'll return the computation to extending 0, 0. So, okay, that does in fact mean that we can sort of, in some sense, in a way that zero double jump can see, we can sort of make sure that phi sub of A has to extend some string of length 2 that everything agrees. All right. Is that great? Are we done? I'll just illustrate this for a second. This is what notice what happens if we drop back. Remember at B1, we also saw the computation 0, 0. So if we cancel everything that was enumerated after it, we return that. So is this enough? No, not quite. I say, unfortunately, it makes it prove a little interesting. So this works great as long as the sort of those as long as the limit of the double limit always exists. But we can't ensure that. That sort of and the upshot of that is that we might we have to sort of continue on not knowing whether or not how we'll end up whether or not we're going to end up putting C sub alpha into P, and we have to even if it looks like we're not going to, but we have to be ready for that to happen at any time. All right, and so doing that means that we when we do that with that doing that means that this isn't quite enough, even though we can sort of say, oh look, we have to extend this thing a finite length. That's not enough. That's not enough to make sure that sort of we meet all the requirements. So I'll just say briefly, how do we do that? Well, the trick is basically instead of to look at strings of finite length, we try and we increase the length of the string each time. So we ask, oh look, is it the case sort of we eventually extend a string of length n at stage n, and eventually putting that together, it doesn't, I will leave the details and running a little bit of time here, but it does in fact turn out that we in fact can make sure that A doesn't compute a weak 3 generic. Now, I want to say a little bit about why this is interesting, because I know that's a lot of detail and stuff like this. So the motivation and sort of why care about this? Well, ultimately, there's this question that I'm really interested in, which is is there an omega REA set that's a minimal arithmetic degree? Now, the omega REA sets are in some sense the arithmetic analog of the RE sets. So that, the hypothesis is really, well, that should really be false. All right, but it's a lot harder to prove. And now, well, the one obvious way of proving it, if you were able to show that, say, every omega REA set that's not arithmetic, if that had to compute an omega generic, for instance, well, that would have been great. That because an omega generic, that itself is not arithmetic, and it can't be the same arithmetic degree of our omega REA set. So that would have solved this result. Not explicitly, but this result, if we extend this to higher levels of genericity, basically says that's not going to work. But that leaves open this interesting question that might work. Well, so does every Spasnik run function compute something that's generic under local forcing and a non-isolated path on the tree is generic? In this case, let's say that every for instance, every omega REA set A compute an F that's omega generic on some T and a non-isolated path on D. And that would be a nice way to answer this question, because look, if we have every omega REA set is a pi02 singleton. So such an F, and such an F wouldn't be the same arithmetic degree as any arithmetic singleton. So it couldn't either be arithmetic or of the same degree as our omega REA set. So if every omega REA set computed such a locally generic thing, then great, that would solve the problem. And just just a note on this is that this issue of this issue of sort of fast growing really does tell us a fair bit about what's going on in the arithmetic degrees as well. That if you're if A is arithmetically escaping, so remember being delta zero n escaping means you're not dominated by any function computed with 0 at the end, arithmetically escaping, you're not dominated by any arithmetic function. Well, if you're not arithmetically escaping, then your omega jump is less than or equal to 0 to the omega plus c. So in some sense, it is the case that sort of not, being sort of not having much fast growing property does constrain what you can do in the arithmetic degrees. Fortunately, it doesn't constrain it quite as much as you might like, because you can still find minimal degrees that have that property. But that's sort of the hope here, and the reason I'm interested in this research. I'm hoping something about this rate of growth information will be able to tell us about what's going on in the arithmetic degrees. All right, I'll leave it there and take questions.
So you like to play with the REA hierarchy.
Yeah.
And then other hierarchies and how they mix.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just that, I saw one of the Leo has these proofs about the omega REA sets. They're just magical. And they, and I just really, maybe convinced me I really wanted to have a theorem about them. So yes, he's just, it's just like, oh, we just do this. And then, out of, infinity, the recursion theorem proves everything. And yeah, so now I want such a theorem.
Okay, you're getting closer?
I think so. I hope so.
So what's the ultimate goal there then? Do you have a theorem that will?
That is, well, the ultimate goal is to, I would very much like to show that there's that no pi's, well, like to really show that no pi02 singleton can be of minimal arithmetic degree, or at least no omega REA set can be of minimal arithmetic degree.
So you think you'll have to use the recursion theorem for that?
I don't know. If this way works, then probably not. If they all compute some locally generic, maybe not. But if it's more sort of, what you definitely have to use the recursion theorem for is to prove downward density for the omega REA degrees, which is even harder. And I think that's true, but who knows?
So it's clear that your thesis about it had a great impact on you.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could say the same about your postdoc about. No, okay.
Well, I'm not going to compliment you here, Peter.
Gotta do something. All right, any more questions? Well, thanks, Peter, for a great talk. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
I don't know, it's your account.
Yeah, but I can't. We're done.
Just pause it.
No, I'm going to stop it, and then I could.